Okay, thank you everybody for showing up. We are continuing our class on Tefillah, and we are holding in the middle of Yotzer. So Yotzer or is the first bracha of Kriya Shema in the morning by Shachrit, and we discussed last week the earliest ancient traditions of the Yotzer, and we analyzed how and why it's possible that a bracha, which is not a berachas hamitzvahs, would end up being the introductory bracha for Kriya Shema. If you think about it, if one was going to take a Torah obligation like Kriya Shema and conduct or create a blessing for it, it should start with Asher Kedusha of Yotzer. However, as we saw last week, the berachos hamitzvos in the style of Asher Kedusha of Yotzer were not invented, of course, until the time of the later Tanaim. While the Bracha of Yotzer is in itself so ancient that it probably predates the invention of the Asher Kedushanim Nusayis V'Tzivanu formula. And therefore, where we're holding from last week is that we have seen that the Yotzer blessing is a very ancient blessing, and it's probably from the time of the earlier Tanaim, if not even from the time of the Beis HaMikdash itself. Now, it is not a prayer about Kriya Shema. It doesn't speak about Kriya Shema. Rather, it's a prayer about sunrise, and it is a prayer about starting one's day. This prayer seems to have been the most beautiful one and the one that became the most popular in the time, by the time of Talmud Bavli. So that's where we're holding from last week. And I want to recap with everybody by, let me share my screen. Let's, yes. Apologies, this is a little bit difficult on a single screen laptop, but I would like to recap with everybody I'll make it a little bigger. Hold up. We're gonna get there. 1 second. There we go. Okay, I would like to recap one of the most important parts that we saw last week, and that was the core text of the Bracha of the Yotzer. I'm sorry if you're listening over audio, but if you're watching the video on Spotify or on YouTube, you'll see in front of you on the presentation the core text of the Bracha of Yotzer. Now, this is Rav Sadia Gaon's version for Yotzer Liyachid. If a person is alone and he doesn't have a tzibur with him, according to Rav Sadia Gaon, he's not allowed to say the Kedusha at all. Instead, he has to say this text of Berachos HaYotzer, which omits any middle part of the Yotzer benediction, the Yotzer blessing, which has anything speaking about Kedusha. And let's read it together. Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Yotzer or vorei choshech, oseh shalom uveres hakol, hamer la'aretz v'ladar naleh barachim rabim, v'tuvo mechadish b'chol yom tamid maaseh bereshis. Some versions have kamor lo serim gedolim kimchaso baruch Hashem Yotzer hamaorot. That is the entire bracha. Nothing about Kedusha there, nothing about angels. This itself is the whole blessing of Yotzer Ar. Now, later in the time of the Rishonim, this Gersa was forgotten. In Rav Sadia Gaon's time, and this is attested to in the Geniza, many people had this Gersa. A lot of people had this written down as their personal Gersa for Yotzer Ar. This is what people would say in the morning. If they didn't have a tzibur especially, this is what people would say all the time. However, in later times, in the time of the Rishonim, if you look in the poskim, like such as the Torah in Nuntes, many of the poskim have an abridged version which includes the entire angelic part of Yotzer Ar. However, it omits parts like the actual words of Kadosh 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 Hashem Tzivakot. And in some versions they would just say Ve'omrim Kadosh Ubaruch, and in some of them they would end by, I think, by the second Tisbarach Hashem Elokeinu. Every Rishon had his own way of saying, okay, well, you're not Betzibur, you don't have a congregation with you, so you shouldn't be saying Kedusha. And they had their own version of an abridged Yotzer Ar. But for tonight's study, in order to better understand why the Yotzer Ar is bigger than Rav Sadia Gaon's bracha, and why is Yotzer Ar the longest bracha that we have, I created for everyone here a document which will help everybody visualize the Yotzer much better. And I encourage anybody who's listening to the audio to switch to video for a minute, because this is a very helpful document. So with Rav Sadia Gaon's bracha, let me admit Gary. Rav Sadia Gaon's bracha of Yotzer is essentially on this document the sections 1 and sections 10, right? You have Baruch Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Yotzer Beracha Choshech. The first two parts here, the first part and the last part of the bracha, the Yotzer, and section 10, Kamoro Selim Gilum Chasto, that's the core text. That was the original. Everything in between from number 2 here, rubric 2, all the way to rubric 9, all of that here surrounds and are accompanying verses to the Kedusha, meaning that the Kedusha is an expansion, and all of these other components here are expansions of the Berachas Yotzer, meaning that the Kedusha is a foreign element to the Bracha of Yotzer. Now, let me just glaze through it with you for a few seconds, and we're gonna understand the most important points here. First of all, as I noted before, Yotzer, the bracha about sunrise, and the angels have nothing to do with each other. Those are two completely separate topics. So in order to bridge the two topics, it begins with a general term, and it takes a pasuk from Tehillim, and it says, Marabu Masecha Hashem, this is rubric number 2, Kulam Basisa Malaretz Kinyanecha. Instead of just speaking about sunrise and the celestial hosts, we make it more general, and we speak about the malachim and all the other spiritual beings that God created. And then it bridges, Hamelach HaMaramam Levado Meyaz, the exalted king who existed since the time of creation, and it begins talking more specifically about creation and who was exalted from that time. But rubric 4 is very strange. We're gonna have to see that study this a little bit later. Rubric 4, Elokei Olam Berachamech Rabim Rachem Aleinu. That's a techina. That's a petition. It doesn't seem that there's any great reason for rubric 4 being there for that section about asking Hashem for mercy, but for some reason it's there, and we'll study that when we get to it. Next is a piyut called Kel Baruch Gedol Deya, which we're going to see soon. Then we have 2 extra sections, one with 2 tisbarachs, and the next one with a whole bunch of kulams. And all of the kulams introduce how all of the angels together sing to Hashem, and they begin Kadosh, 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 and then they switch over about the Ofanim instead of the regular Malachim. The Ofanim say Baruch Kavod Hashem Imkomo, and then you have a closing with Al Baruch Hu, which talks about the intimacy of God's immanence with mankind. So this is how the Yotzer is expanded with subrubrics here, number 2 all the way through 9, with a Kedusha interrupting the actual Bracha of Yotzer from section 1 and section 10. All of these are interruptions in order to envelope and to bring in the Kedusha into the Berachas Yotzer, which will bring us to our study tonight, which is the Kedusha in general. How in the world are we supposed to understand Kedusha? What is this prayer? Where did it come from? And how old is it? And as everybody here, I'm sure, knows, the Kedusha is not one prayer. The Kedusha is multiple prayers. We have a Kedusha de Yotzer, we have a Kedusha de Amida, and we have a Kedusha de Sidra. Anybody who prays every day, we know that there are 3 different types of Kedusha. So the actual history of the Kedusha is an incredibly complicated, incredibly thorny problem. And which Kedusha is the earliest and which Kedusha is the latest, which one was created first, which one was created second, why it was created, and when it was created, all of these thorny questions can take up multiple shurim, and we will spend more time on this, especially as we get to the Kedusha d'Amida, when we get to the Kedusha d'Sidra. But for tonight, we're going to have a very valuable introduction into the main core history of the Kedusha. What is this text? Why is it in Kedusha de Yotzer? And why was it composed? So usually when we discuss prayer, we don't just ask, why do we say this? We ask, what were the motivations behind this prayer? What was the motivation of not just the Kedusha, but stupping a Kedusha into the Berachas Yotzer? We have to really pay attention to why would somebody put this idea of a Kedusha, of praising God in an angelic way, into the, into the bracha about sunrise. So let's start with the earliest evidence we have of anything called Kedusha at all, and that would be in the Tosefta. The Tosefta Aleph here has a very interesting Tosefta and Brachas is a very interesting anecdote. It says Rabbi Yehuda haya aina em hamavarech. Yehuda would respond with the person saying the blessings. We don't know what that means. It could be Kriya Shema, it could be Shemona Esrei, Kadesh 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 Hashem Tzavakis Malach Halaretz Kavaydai, and Baruch Kavod Hashem Emkaimai Kol Elu haya Rabbi Yehuda aimer em hamavarech. Now Rabbi Yehuda is a later Tana, and it gives us no information about what he's responding, why he's responding, or if there's something called Kedusha. It just says that he responds to the person making a blessing. We have no actual clear information about what it's talking about. It would seem to be talking about the Kedusha Da'amida, the Kedusha Shemayin Esrei, since the first part of this section is talking about the Amida, but we just don't actually have any concrete evidence that this itself is talking about an Amida. So we do have a juxtaposition of Kedusha, of this pasuk in Yeshaya, Kadesh, Kadesh, Kadesh Hashem Sebakais. We have a juxtaposition between that pasuk and Baruch Hu Hashem Mekayme, which is the pasuk in Yechezkel. That in and of itself is extremely important. Having this connection between the pasuk in Yeshaya and the pasuk in Yechezkel, these two psukim, this is in itself is the earliest source we have for something similar to the Kedusha that we have today. We just have no idea what this Tosefta is actually talking about. The next source is much later, as it's in Talmud Yerushalmi, but it's much more explicit. The Talmud Yerushalmi tells a very interesting story. It says, "Batitai ishtatak be'ofanaya," that a person named Batitai was paralyzed. He was no longer, he got frozen up while he was leading the services, and he was no longer able to continue in the section talking about the Ofanim. So what did they do? They came and asked Rabbi Abun, what should we do? The Shliach Tzibur had a stroke. What are we going to do? Amar lo Rabbi Avun said to them, let the Shliach Tzibur who's going to come and replace him, continue from where he left off. I mean, they asked Rabbi Avun, we learned that you have to start from the bracha where the other person left off. He said, because they began answering Kedusha, it's as if you started a new bracha, so let him just continue from the next section of Kedusha. This is a very explicit Gemara in the Yerushalmi that in the middle of the Kedusha of the Amida, since it says over Lefnei Teva, right? It says gesture over Tachtav. This is a very clear Gemara, which is talking about a Kedusha by the Amida, and it also mentions the Malachim in the sense that their Girsa by the Kedusha of Amida had a discussion of the Ofanim. This is a very clear source from the Yerushalmi. The next thing we'll see briefly is the Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara Brachos says that Rabbi Shua ben Levi Omer that it's talking about when a person comes late. He says if he's able to get up there, if he's able to daven before the Shliach Tzibur says Kedusha, he should daven, and if not, he should not daven with the congregation. And it also says that for Kedusha, you need 10 people. It doesn't say what Kedusha is. The Gemara in Bavli literally never defines Kedusha. We have no idea if it means Kedusha, if it means Kedusha as we're familiar with it today from the Chazar Sashatz, or if it means the bracha of Kedusha. So again, a very obscure source, but it's definitely a source for something called Kedusha. Okay. So now, if you think about it, in order to associate the Kedusha with Malachim. In order to associate the Kedusha with Yotzer, what you have to say is that there's going to be an association between the Malachim, between angels, the heavenly bodies, and the creation of the world and sunrise. You have to say that there's a known theology between angels and sunrise and creation in order to assume that you would have Yotzer that you would put a Kedusha in the Yotzer. So we have to ask ourselves now, we have some evidence from the time in the later Tanaim and the time of the Amoraim in the 4th century. So roughly the end of the 2nd century to the end of the 4th century. We have some evidence here that there was something called a Kedusha being done, and it had to do with Malachim. Okay. Well, what would be the motivation for putting that into the Yotzer? If it was in the Yotzer by that time, let's just make an assumption for the moment. If it was in the Yotzer at that time, why would I connect Yotzer R with the Malachim? You would only connect it if there was a pre-existing theology, if there was a pre-existing understanding, a Messiah, so to speak, that Yotzer, that the creation of the sun and the moon and the creation of the world was closely linked. The celestial hosts were closely linked to the Shira of the Malachim and the service of the Malachim every day. Now, where would we find such a thing? So very early in this research, in the research of Jewish liturgy, a lot of the scholars, such as Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport, who's pictured here, a lot of the scholars jumped on the assumption that this was a insertion of the so-called Merkava mystics, the people who believed in or who loved plumbing the depths of the Sisrei Hamarkava, the hidden depths of the chariot of God, or so to speak, the throne of God. People who were obsessed with either Markava literature or angel literature, like angelology, the study of angels. These must have been the people who were responsible for adding angelic parts into the bracha of Yetzer. And in their view, it must have been people who believed that speaking and reiterating the Shira of the Malachim was a pious thing to do, was a sacred thing to do, and to know the names of the Malachim, and to speak about the Malachim, and to sing the way the Malachim do, was all part of Judaism and was an important part of our Avodah. So among the Tanaim, it's very difficult to make to pinpoint who exactly was pro-angelology and who was not. That's a kind of a difficult thing to do around the Tanaim and the Meiraim. Some scholars like to do it by like Louis Finkelstein, but for the most part, the way Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport does it is he brings a fascinating. Let me pull it up for you on the screen. He brings a fascinating quotation from Yosef from Josephus, and he believes that the tefillah of Yotzer, that the tefillahs of Kedusha inside Yotzer, not just Kedusha, but also Amer Lar Sardar Malah, and also Keladona Kolamasim, all the parts which are angelic inside Yotzer, doesn't come from the rabbinic sects. It came from the less educated sects. It came from the sects of Judaism that were not rabbinic and were more into angelology than the Rabbanim were, and were more into not worshiping angels, but at least were much more into emulating angels. Let me show you this quotation here from Josephus. It's a fascinating thing. Here we go. Josephus is giving a testimony here about the Essene sect, the sect of the Essenes, and he says at sunrise, Yarchu Tfilos Yeduos Mukubales Mavaisam, they would arrange the known liturgies of their forefathers al inyan zrichasa v'harasa, on about the topic of the sunrise and its lighting of the world. It sounds like what Josephus is doing is that he's saying that these Jewish people, the Essenes, would say brachos about the Yetziras Ha'ar, about sunrise. And everybody knows that the Essene sect was very into knowing the names of the Malachim and praying within the names of the Malachim. So he says it must be, it's got to be that the Essenes were the ones who created the whole Kedusha of Yotzer and shtupped it into Yotzer. And all these piyutim like Kel Baruch Adol Dea and all the insertions into Yotzer, this was all done before the Hadrianic persecutions in the 1st century or earlier in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. Louis Finkelstein goes even further. And he says that, let me just share my screen. I think it was Finkelstein, and Ginsburg also likes this theory. But these are two rabbis who were the leaders of the conservative movement. So in their research, they really like this theory that it was these mystics from the time of the Tanaim and from the time of the second Beis Hamikdash. I believe it was Finkelstein did this in the Revue d'études juives, and Ginsburg did this in his first book on Geonica. Essentially, what they're saying is that if you look at the Mishnah and Talmud, they don't mention anything about a Kedusha in the Beis Hamikdash. So most likely, they believe, or Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport is right, that it was the mystically inclined and the people who were all into angels who did put this in. However, first of all, the Kehanim would have never accepted it because the aristocracy was rabbinic, the aristocracy was conservative. They would have never allowed something into the tefillos, especially into tefillos in Beis Hamikdash, which had shmeks of, which had traces of angelic worship or angelic emulation in it, and therefore it must have been rejected by the Kehanim. But just from the character of the tefillos, both of them see it as being very early. They think the Kedusha was invented and put into the Yotzer from the earliest stages, and this was an innovation not from the rabbis but from the popular masses who liked praying with the Song of the Angels, and eventually became popular enough to emulate the angels in prayer that it became a standard part of the Yotzer. This was the theory among many scholars for a very long time. It wasn't until 1969 that Ezra Fleischer, who was the Titanic scholar of Piyut, pushed back against this a little bit. He said, well, first of all, take a step back. Two things. First of all, the whole many people have built all sorts of towers around this belief. They believe, first of all, it must have been created in Eretz Yisrael, and it must have been created in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, and it must be people who are all into the Merkava, and this, well, I should say at least the angelic literature. He says, if you speak to Gershom Sholem, who was the great scholar of Kabbalah, he takes a look at the Sifrei HaEchalos, and he's not sure that they were composed when people think they were composed. Some scholars, what they did is that they said, you know what? This is not quite angelic mysticism. This is not the Essenes, but this is the Gaonic mystics, the people who wrote the Sifrei HaEchalos. Says, well, hold your horses. First of all, we don't know for sure when the Sifrei HaEchalos were written. Gershom Sholem believes they were written in the time of the Tanaim, the middle generations of the Tanaim. And second of all, we find many places that Chazal themselves speak about the Malachim and the Shirais of the Malachim, and it's not mystical at all. They're not talking about Kabbalah. They're just talking about the Shirais of the Malachim. One of the very important Makayers for this is the Gemara in Chulin. And I hope I could find it fast enough to share it with you. Yes, I opened it. Hold on. Let's learn this Gemara together. At the bottom, we'll look at it for a second. The Gemara in Chulin is speaking about how Malachim can say the name of Hashem after three words, Kadesh, 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 Hashem Tzavakis, Melech Haaretz Kavaydai, while people can say it after one word, two words, Yishma Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. This is a famous Gemara when it talks about how Yaakov Avinu defeated the angel, and the angel says, I have to go back to Shemayim. So to skip all of that, just in the interest of time, on the bottom here it says, Ella achas emeres kadesh v'achas emeres kadesh kadesh v'achas emeres kadesh 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 Hashem Tzavakis. Right, so it says that the angels took turns, and each one says a different level of kedusha. So the Gemara says Vaha Ika Baruch. There's the next section of Baruch. Sorry here, Baruch V'ed Hashem Kaimai. Let me just go here. So the Gemara says Baruch Ifanim Hudam Relay. No, they do say Baruch after the Kadesh, 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 but that's the Ifanim, not the original Malachim. Therefore, they can say the Shem Hashem after two words instead of after three. Which shows you that the Gemara already, by the way, understood that Kedusha and Baruch are associated, which is a slightly later source in the Tosefta, but it also shows you that the Gemara has, which is not mystical, has no Kabbalah, has no problem talking about Kedusha and Baruch together, and has no problem talking about such things as the Malachim. So he pushes back up against this whole idea that it must have been pre-Hadrianic, or it must have been either to say that it's so early that it's from the Beis Hamikdash, or to say that it's so late that it's from the time of the Gaonic mystics, because it's Merkava literature. He says, calm down. We don't have to say that it was mystics who put it in. We don't have to say that it was really late or really early. We could put it to the time of the later Tanaim, or to the time of the middle generation of Tanaim. It doesn't have to go back so far. Okay. That was so far the pushback from Ezra Fleischer. So where does that leave us now? Where that leaves us now is to look at external sources. Let's try to look at sources that aren't Jewish, because the earliest Christians were Jews. And if we take a look at their prayers, we can see that these Jews were developing their own prayers that were trying to become their own religion. They were trying to develop their own prayers for their own religion, but being Jews, they were borrowing liturgy from liturgy that they already knew. And by studying the early Christian liturgy, one can see in it very large telltale signs that the earliest Christians knew and were very familiar with the Kedusha, the Kedusha. So now, nobody really has been smart enough or brave enough to do a comparative liturgy, a comparative study between the liturgy of Christians and the liturgy of Jews. It's, in order to know a lot about the liturgy of Jews, you have to live a lifetime as a Jew. You have to know everything there is. This year especially is geared towards people who daven fairly frequently. And if you daven fairly frequently, you would know the ins and outs of Jewish liturgy. And to be an expert on Jewish liturgy is a decades-long what's it called, profession, let alone to be a scholar of Christian liturgy would also be a decades-long profession. So very few people have been brilliant enough or smart enough or knowledgeable enough to do a comparison between Jewish and Christian liturgy. One person attempted, his name was Eric Werner, and he wrote a book called The Sacred Bridge. He happened to be a brilliant scholar from Hebrew University, from JTS. And again, it's a flawed work because you can't be an expert in everything, but it's an excellent try. And having dipped his toe in both, he does come away with some very important conclusions. And I'm just going to reference his work here. I have this book at home, just for the basic core here to tell you what we need to know, and we'll move on. So there's something called the how do I pronounce this? I'm sorry, Apostolic Constitutions, which is an early church document. I just stole this thumbnail from YouTube. Apologies to YouTube. And in the Apostolic Constitutions, which is a 4th century text, we find a prayer called the Prayer of St. James. And I took out all the parts here because this is a base medrash and a Jewish shul. We're not going to put in all the the Jesus stuff. Just apologies to anybody who's not Jewish and is listening. We just have to cut all that stuff out. But here we have, in the Prayer of St. James, you have something which absolutely parallels Yotzer. This is from the 4th century, and this is a very early clue that the Kedusha of Yotzer was known to the Jewish people or the non-Jewish people who were the early Christians. If you look in this long prayer of St. James, you have, for you are he who framed the heaven as an arch and stretched it out like the covering of a tent and founded the earth upon nothing by your mere will, and who fixed the firmament and prepared the night and day, who brought out the light of your treasures and on its departure brought out darkness. You could already hear you could hear exactly what they're saying. And then in the next part here, I'm going to skip to the bottom. With constant loud voices, and let all the people say it with them, holy, 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 Lord of the hosts, heaven and earth are full of his glory. Be blessed forever. In the Hebrew, it would be Baruch Hashem la'olam, amen v'amen. And afterwards, let the high priest say, meaning the person who's leading the services should say, for you are truly holy and most holy, the highest and most holy, highly exalted forever. Now, I should point out here just a diuk, a little bit of a diuk here, is that their girsa here is not Moloich ha'aretz kivaydai. Theirs is Moloich ha'aretz v'shamayim kivaydai. They get this from somebody named Clement of Rome. Clement of Rome was the bishop of Rome in the 1st century. And he changed the pasuk in Yeshaya. When he mentions the pasuk in Yeshaya, he says Kadosh 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 Hashem Tzevakos, Moloich ha'aretz v'shamayim kivaydai. And that's because of their own ways of believing the way Yeshu, the way Jesus, they believed caused redemption, etc. So they changed the pasuk. They changed the way it is. So we could see that, first of all, Clement of Rome saw that saying the Kedusha 3 times, mentioning the Kedusha was an important part of his theology. But already by the 4th century, we see that Christians are adopting prayers which are so similar to Yotzer that it's impossible to ignore this evidence that there was a Kedusha, that the Jews were aware of something like Kedusha de Yotzer in their time. This is almost explicit evidence of such a bracha in that time. Even though we don't have a Gemara about it explicitly, there's no Gemara which has anything like a Kedusha de Yotzer. The external evidence gives us a very good shot that this is real and this is something that existed in their time. Okay. Now let's move a little bit forward. We're running out of time. It's already 9:20. Oh, and I should also mention that there's till today, there's 2 prayers that the Christians say in I wrote this down because I don't know what any of this means, but I'll tell you the words. One of them is called the Trisagion, the other one is called the Sanctus. And the Christian liturgical scholars, they got into a fight with the Jew, not a fight really, but it was kind of like a disrespectful disagreement in the early 20th century, because the Jewish scholars of liturgy did their own research, and the Christian scholars of liturgy did their research. And the Christian scholars wanted to basically push the primacy and the superiority of the Sanctus and the Trisagion as these being the real prayers. And the Jewish scholars are like, respectfully, you guys don't know what you're talking about because you don't understand Kedusha de Yotzer. And it went kind of back and forth, essentially. But some of it got a little bit shots across the bow. But essentially till today, the Kedusha, so to speak, is a core part of Christian liturgy. And the Syriac version of it, I think they call it Korbono Kadisha in the Syriac. They call it literally the Korban Kadosh. They put it in their liturgy Ad Yemazeh because they literally got it from us. There's really no denying that the Christian liturgy today, which puts such an emphasis on the thrice holy, on saying holy 3 times, comes from the Jewish sources. But thanks to these sources, the Christian sources, we know that Kedusha of Yotzer was in existence well before the 4th century. So we don't have any Jewish sources for it. We don't have any Jewish sources to prove to us that Kedusha of Yotzer is that early, but we definitely have external sources that Kedusha of Yotzer is very early. Okay. Now, everybody agrees. Give me a second. So as I mentioned earlier, exactly which Kedusha was the earliest is a matter of debate. It gets very thorny, and we're not going to get into the complexities about which Kedusha came first. Kedusha Damida, Kedusha Yotzer, or Kedusha Sidra. But one thing we do know, and that is that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, those who follow the Minhagim of Talmud Yerushalmi, those Jews did not say the Kedusha every day. They only said the Kedusha, both of Shemoneh Esrei and the Kedusha of Yotzer, they only said it on Shabbat and Yom Tov. While the Jews of Babel would say Kedusha of Yotzer and Kedusha of Amida every single day. We know this from a famous document called the document of Pirkei ben Baboy. Pirkei ben Baboy was a scholar who was a student or a disciple of a disciple of Rav Yehuda Gaon, one of the Gaonim who ruled in the 760s. So Pirkei ben Baboy sends a whole letter to the community in Eretz Yisrael, disputing so many of their minhagim and trying to argue for the supremacy of the Torah of the Jews in Babel. And one of his arguments is that you're all making a mistake, and all of your communities, at least the ones that haven't been affected by our supreme better liturgies, most of your communities are still saying Kedusha of Yotzer and Kedusha Amida. I'm sorry, he only mentions Kedusha Amida, but Kedusha Amida only on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and it's a big mistake. This teaches us that in his time, in the late 700s or the early 800s, and we also know this from Masechah Seifrim, so it could be even earlier, that was their minhag. So now, if the Jews in Eretz Yisrael weren't saying it daily, and the Jews in Babel were, this tells us something about its evolution. Either it started in Shabbat and then evolved to the daily usage, or it was daily, and then they took it out of Chol because they decided it should be more kadosh and only be for Shabbat. It's not clear. It tells us something about its evolution. It's just not clear exactly what it tells us about its evolution. We do the fact that it's not there by the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, but it is there by the Jews of Babel. It tells us something, but exactly what it tells us, we don't know. It could be that they felt it was more kadosh, or it could be that the Bavliim. Some people put it this way. They say, well, it originated in Eretz Yisrael, then it migrated to Bavel and it became much more popular and much more important to Bavel, and then it got pushed back to Eretz Yisrael, and they forced the Bnei Eretz Yisrael to start taking on the minhag of saying Kedusha Damida every day. That's one way of putting it. Now, everybody agrees that Kedusha of Yotzer is really old. We've gotten to that point in this year where we could all agree that it's definitely earlier than the 4th century, possibly as early as the 3rd or 2nd century. Now, that's very nice. So Kedusha of Yotzer is really, really old. But the Kedusha, the way we have it in our bracha, almost everybody agrees that the way we have it is later. It's probably from the 400, 500, or 600s where the Kedusha, the way we have it, developed and evolved. It's not as early as the Beis Hamikdash or the mid-century, the middle generations of the Tanaim. Almost everybody agrees on that, simply because of the earliest languages we have of it in the Geniza, and we're running out of time here, but because of many of the earliest versions we have of it in the Geniza, and especially the versions of Rav Sadia Gaon, which I wish I could pull up in time, but we have enough evidence to convince us that our version is not the oldest version. So let's begin with an example here. First of all, take this for an example. By the time of the Sefer Itim, who lived in the 12th century, he was Rav Yehuda Bar Zilai, the Sefer Itim says that all of those people who add the piyutim on Shabbos, Hakol Yoducha Hakol Yishabachucha, or they add the piyut of Lakel Asher Shabbat, or they add the piyut of Keladona Kol Hamasim. All of those people are making a huge mistake. You cannot allow to add piyutim into a text which Chazal made a takana for, and he says that anybody who does that is saying a hefsek, and they should say it outside of Yitzhar. Say it before, if you have to say it before the bracha, and say the bracha separately. It seems that, just as an example, I'm giving this here as an example, that already by the 12th century, the Spanish Jews consider the Yitzhar, at least the way we have it today, to be already a set text, a fixed text from the time of the Antiknes Sagdaila, and anybody who was adding these other piyutim, these Shabbos editions, was making a huge mistake. While it's hysterical that Rav Yehuda Bar Zilai himself doesn't see this, that the piyut of Kel Baruch Gadol Deah is also a later edition, and it's clear from the manuscripts of the Geniza, and it's clear from just looking at the bracha itself that it's a later edition. So it's very interesting that we have all sorts of different layers added onto the Kedusha that weren't necessarily part of the original cortex. So there's something called, and we have 3 minutes left to talk about this, but in the history of the Bracha of Yotzer, there's a body of piyutim called the Yotzers. There's a book called Hayetzes B'Havutam U'V'Patkutam, right? The Yotzers in their development and evolution by Ezra Fleischer. And essentially, this book here is a study, and the best study, on this type of piyut genre called the Yotzers. And what I want to demonstrate, moving on with next week, is how most of these expansions of the bracha of Yotzer, the way we have Yotzer are today, most of these expansions are remnants of poetic expansions from ancient piyutim. So let's just take one, for example, that Ezra Fleischer shows. Let's take Kel Baruch Gadol Deah, right? Kel Baruch Gadol Deah is a, hold up, let me see if I have it in front of me. Yeah, it's divided by sub-rubric. Let me share my screen one more time. Sorry to anybody listening. Okay, so Kel Baruch Gadol Deah is a quatrain. It's a poem which is basically split into 4 sections per stanza. Kel Baruch Gadol Deah Hechinu Fa'al Zarei Chama. Right now, the exact language of it, maybe we'll discuss a little bit more next week if we have time. But essentially, what Ezra Fleischer demonstrates in his book on Yotzers that I just showed is that there are the earliest Yotzers, the Yotzers that were done by the pre-classical Paitanim, were in this form. And we have piyutim like this, like Tikanta Shabbat or Tzita Korbanotah. Or let's take one that's a brother or a sister to Kel Baruch Gadol Deah. Give me a second here to pull it up for you. There's a bracha called a piyut called Asher B'Rav Chachma. Some of the versions in the Cairo Geniza, instead of saying Al Kel Asher Shabbat, they have this. Asher B'Rav Chachma Gedula Darash Hechin V'Etkin Ziv Chamato Tipecha Yemino Kechokvei Levana V'Ornei Ro Sachol Amo Po'alei Tzedek Kirovei Rachamav Shir Tishpachot Sharulam Alkam. Also, an alphabetic acrostic. It goes through the aleph base. It's also a quatrain of 4. We have many of these types of, not many, I would say maybe a dozen of these types of piyutim from the Cairo Geniza, which are from the earliest types of Yotzers. This is from the pre-classical era, from the time of Yossi Bar Yossi or earlier, from the 5th century or earlier. So because he sees, for an example, Kel Baruch Gadol Deah, since it matches the pattern of all of these other piyutim, it must be that it's from a Yotzer, from the earliest Yotzers, from the 5th or the 6th century for Kriya Shema. Just give me 1 second to pause the recording. Give me a second. Sorry to anybody listening. We've run out of time here, so I'm just going to end with this really quickly. Essentially, his points are twofold, and we'll recap this next week. This was clearly written in Eretz Yisrael because the birth of Piyut was in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore, if we see that Kel Baruch Gadol Deah is an early Piyut from Eretz Yisrael, it must be that Kel Baruch Gadol Deah, which is an early Yotzer, it's a remnant of an early Yotzer, must be that Kel Baruch Gadol Deah was actually written for Shabbat, because they only said Yotzerot on Shabbat. And they only did Kedusha on Shabbat. So therefore, because it's a Yotzer, which is written to introduce a Kedusha, right? It ends with Kvod Kelo Kedusha To. Therefore, clearly, Kel Baruch Dildea, just as an example for tonight, is a remnant of the Yotzeros, and it was originally written for Shabbat. So we're going to get into the exactitudes more of that next week. B'ezrat Hashem, thank you everybody for your time and attention, and I hope we've enlightened a little bit of the earliest history of the Yotzer. And I think besides just those core texts, B'ezrat Hashem, we will also, besides those core texts, we will also try to examine some of the theologies which are in it, because tonight we've been mostly on the history, but if we can, as we go through those Yotzeros and we go through the different components of Yotzer Ar Shel Chol and of Shabbat, we will hopefully uncover some of the depth of this text, because there is, again, layered meaning, and we do have to discuss it. So, B'ezrat Hashem, we will catch you all next week, and let me stop the recording now.